The tourist attempts to intimidate royal guard with dog, but it backfires in spectacular fashion. Before coming to the story, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got another amazing royal guard story coming tomorrow at the same time. You won't want to miss it. Asterisk, the morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a middle-aged businessman from Chicago who had flown to London for what he called his once-in-a-lifetime European adventure. His expensive camera hung around his neck, and his designer sneakers squeaked against the ancient stones with each step. Marcus had always been the type of person who demanded attention wherever he went. Back home, his wealth and loud personality usually got him what he wanted. Restaurant reservations that were supposedly full suddenly had tables available. Store managers bent rules for him when he complained loudly enough. He had grown accustomed to being the center of attention. In London would be no different. Standing beside him on a diamond-studded leash was Duchess, his prized French bulldog. The small dog wore a custom-made jacket that cost more than most people's monthly salary, complete with tiny sunglasses that Marcus thought made her look absolutely adorable. He had paid extra fees to bring Duchess on the plane, ignoring the flight attendant's concerned looks when the dog barked during takeoff as the crowd thickened around the palace gates. Marcus noticed how everyone seemed to be following unspoken rules. People spoke in hushed tones, kept their distance from the barriers, and watched the guards with respectful silence. The famous red-coated sentries stood motionless at their posts, their tall black bearskin hats creating imposing silhouettes. Against the palace walls, Marcus scoffed at what he saw as unnecessary formality. These were just men in costumes, he thought, probably making minimum wage to stand around and look serious. He had dealt with security guards before, and they were usually easy to intimidate or charm, depending on the situation. The crowd's reverent behavior only reinforced his belief that Europeans were far too impressed by outdated traditions. He pulled out his phone and began live streaming to his social media followers back home. Hey everyone, Marcus here live from London. Am I about to show you how Americans handle these stuffy British traditions? He announced to his phone's camera, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. Several nearby tourists turned to look at him with disapproving expressions. But Marcus was just getting started. Duchess began to whine and pull at her leash, sensing her owner's agitation. The small dog had never been in such a crowded, formal environment, and the unfamiliar sights and sounds were making her nervous. Marcus barely noticed her discomfort, too focused on creating what he was sure would be viral content for his social media accounts. The changing of the guard ceremony was still 20 minutes away, but Marcus was already growing impatient. He had expected London to bend to his will, just like everything else in his life, but the rigid structure and formal atmosphere were starting to annoy him. The guards remained perfectly still, completely ignoring the growing crowd of tourists, taking photos and videos. As Marcus surveyed the scene, his eyes landed on one particular guard stationed near the palace entrance. The soldier stood at perfect attention, his rifle held at a precise angle, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Everything about his posture screamed discipline and professionalism, qualities that Marcus had always found irritating. In others, a mischievous smile spread across Marcus's face as an idea began to form. He had come to London expecting to be impressed, but instead, he was bored by what he saw as theatrical nonsense. It was time to shake things up and show these British soldiers what a real American personality looked like. After all, what was the worst that could happen? They were just guards in funny hats. Marcus adjusted his expensive sunglasses and straightened his designer jacket, preparing to put on what he considered his most charming performance. He had perfected this routine over years of getting his way in restaurants, hotels, and business meetings. The key, he believed, was projecting confidence and making it clear that he was someone important who deserved special treatment. With Duchess in tow, he approached the rope barrier that separated tourists from the guard's position. The soldier remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead in the traditional 1,000-yard stare that royal guards were famous for maintaining. Other tourists kept a respectful distance, content to take photos from behind the designated lines "Excuse me, officer," Marcus called out in his loudest voice, deliberately using the wrong title. He knew perfectly well that these were military guards, not police officers, but he enjoyed the subtle disrespect. "I've got some questions about this whole setup here." The guard's silence only encouraged Marcus further. He had dealt with security personnel who tried to ignore him before, and he'd always found ways to get their attention. He pulled out his wallet and waved it conspicuously, a gesture that usually worked wonders in tourist areas back home. "Listen, I know you guys probably don't make much money standing around in these costumes," Marcus continued, his voice growing louder as nearby tourists began to stare, "but I'm willing to make it worth your while if you can break character. For a few photos, my followers back home would love to see the real person behind the uniform." Still no response. The guard's breathing remained steady and controlled, his grip on his rifle unchanged. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists attempted to break guards' composure dozens of times every day using everything, from jokes to insults to outright harassment. The soldier's name was James Mitchell, and he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years. He had seen it all. Marcus felt his frustration building. God. Back home, his money and persistence always eventually wore people down. Store clerks gave him discounts. Restaurant managers comped his meals, and even government employees bent rules when he applied enough pressure. This silent treatment was completely outside his experience. "Come on, buddy," Marcus said, stepping closer to the rope barrier. "I know you can hear me in there. I've got a French bulldog here that's worth more than you probably make in a year. The least you could do is acknowledge a fellow member of the upper class." Duchess began to bark. Picking up on her owner's agitation, the small dog's high-pitched yaps echoed off the palace walls, drawing even more attention from the crowd. Several parents pulled their children further back, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond typical tourist behavior. Marcus noticed the crowd's reaction and felt energized by the attention. This was exactly the kind of content his social media followers loved, him taking charge of situations where others remained passive. He held up his phone again, making sure to capture both himself and the motionless guard in the frame. "You see this, everyone?" he announced to his live stream audience. "This is what happens when tradition gets in the way of basic human courtesy. This guy won't even acknowledge that I'm talking to him where I come from. We treat visitors with respect." The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his position remained rock solid. His superior officers had briefed him on situations exactly like this one. American tourists in particular sometimes struggled with the concept that money and loud demands wouldn't change centuries old. Military protocols. Marcus interpreted the lack of response as weakness rather than discipline. In his world, silence meant someone was intimidated or unsure of themselves. He had built his entire business career on reading these kinds of signals and pushing harder when he sensed hesitation. "Tell you what," Marcus said, pulling a $100 bill from his wallet and waving it in the air. "I'll make this real simple for you. Just smile for one photo with me and my dog, and this is yours. Easy money for 30 seconds of work." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Several British tourists in the crowd exchanged shocked looks, unable to believe that someone would attempt to bribe a royal guard. Marcus, however, was just getting started. If money wouldn't work, he had other tools in his arsenal. The $100 bill fluttered in the London breeze as Marcus held it higher, making sure everyone in the vicinity could see his attempted bribe. When the guard still refused to acknowledge him, Marcus felt his face growing red with embarrassment and anger. This was not how things were supposed to go. "Fine. Axe!" shouted, stuffing the money back into his wallet with dramatic flair. "You want to play the tough guy? We can do this the hard way." He turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were now filming the spectacle with their own phones. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing British hospitality at its finest," Marcus announced sarcastically. "I came here as a paying tourist, spending my hard-earned American dollars in your economy, and this is the treatment I get." Several people in the crowd began to murmur disapprovingly, but not in the way Marcus expected. Instead of supporting his cause, they seemed embarrassed by his behavior. An elderly British gentleman near the back of the crowd shook his head and whispered to his wife, Americans, honestly. Marcus was too focused on his performance to notice the crowd's reaction. He had convinced himself that he was standing up for tourist rights and showing these stuffy Brits how real customer service worked. In his mind, he was the hero of this story, fighting against an outdated system that refused to acknowledge his importance. Duchess continued to bark and strain against her leash, becoming more agitated as the situation escalated. The small dog had never been in such a tense environment, and her owner's loud voice was making her nervous. She began to growl at the nearby tourists, her tiny teeth bared in what she thought was a threatening display. "You see that?" Marcus said, pointing down at his dog. "Even Duchess knows when someone's being rude. This little lady has better manners than your so-called professional soldiers." Guard James Mitchell had been maintaining his position for over an hour, but his training allowed him to remain focused despite the distraction. He had dealt with aggressive tourists before, including several who had tried to touch him, grab his rifle, or knock off his bearskin hat. This American was loud and obnoxious, but he hadn't crossed any physical lines yet. Marcus, however, was running out of patience. His social media audience was probably getting bored with his verbal sparring match, and he needed to escalate the situation to maintain their attention. He looked down at Duchess, and a new idea began to form in his mind. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Maybe you need a little motivation to start showing some respect." He knelt down and began to unclip Duchess's leash, whispering to the confused dog in what he thought was an encouraging voice. "Go get him, girl. Show this tin soldier what a real American bulldog can do." The crowd gasped as Marcus pointed toward the guard and gave Duchess a gentle push in his direction. The French bulldog, freed from her restraint, looked up at her owner in confusion. She had no idea what he wanted her to do, but she could sense his agitation and excitement. Marcus stood up with a triumphant grin, convinced that he had finally found a way to break through the guard's professional facade. "Let's see you ignore us now," he shouted. "Duchess doesn't understand your stupid silent treatment." What Marcus failed to realize was that royal guards received extensive training in dealing with all types of disruptions, including loose animals. They were prepared for protesters, aggressive tourists, and even genuine security threats. A small French bulldog hardly registered as a serious challenge. More importantly, Marcus had just crossed a line from being an obnoxious tourist to potentially interfering with a military guard's duties. The situation was about to become much more serious than he had anticipated. But his ego prevented him from recognizing the gravity of what he had just done. Guard Mitchell's eyes flickered slightly as he assessed the new threat. His training, automatically kicking in to evaluate the situation and determine the appropriate response. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Duchess stood frozen in the middle of the courtyard, her tiny head swiveling between her owner and the imposing figure of the royal guard. The small French bulldog had no understanding of military protocol or royal traditions. All she knew was that her owner seemed upset and was pointing at a very tall, very still human wearing strange clothes, instead of charging toward the guard as Marcus had hoped. Duchess did what most confused dogs do in unfamiliar situations. She sat down and began to whine, looking back at Marcus with an expression that clearly said, "What exactly do you want me to do?" Marcus's confident grin began to fade as he realized his plan wasn't working. He had expected Duchess to bark at the guard, maybe jump on his boots, or at least cause enough of a distraction to force some kind of reaction. Instead, his prized French bulldog was just sitting there looking lost and slightly pathetic. "Go on, Duchess," Marcus called out, clapping his hands together. "Get him. Show him what you're made of." "Da." He made exaggerated gesturing motions, trying to direct his dog toward the guard's position. The crowd watched in fascination as the expensive French bulldog continued to ignore her owner's commands. Several people began to chuckle quietly, recognizing the situation for what it was: a pampered pet with no idea how to be aggressive, owned by a man who had clearly overestimated his dog's intimidation factor. Guard Mitchell, meanwhile, had assessed the situation and determined that a small, confused French bulldog posed no actual threat to his post or the palace. His training covered everything from terrorist attacks to wild animals that occasionally wandered onto the palace grounds. A pampered house pet hardly qualified as a security concern. However, what did concern him was the tourists' increasingly erratic behavior. Marcus was now walking back and forth behind the rope barrier, gesturing wildly and shouting instructions at his uncooperative dog. This type of escalating agitation often preceded more serious incidents. "Come on, Duchess," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking slightly with frustration. "You're embarrassing me in front of all these people. Do something, anything." But Duchess had discovered something far more interesting than the motionless guard. A small group of children near the edge of the crowd had been eating ice cream, and several drops had fallen onto the cobblestones. The little dog's nose twitched as she caught the scent of vanilla and chocolate. Without warning, Duchess trotted away from both her owner and the guard, heading straight for the sticky sweet spots on the ground. Her tail wagged happily as she began to lick the stones, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Marcus's face turned bright red as he watched his intimidating attack dog, ignored both him and his target in favor of licking ice cream off the ground. The crowd's quiet chuckling grew louder. He could hear people making comments in multiple languages, none of which sounded particularly flattering. "Duchess, get away from there," Marcus shouted, but his dog was now completely focused on her. Impromptu snack. The French bulldog's flat face made loud slurping sounds as she worked to clean every trace of sweetness from the ancient cobblestones. This was definitely not the viral video content Marcus had been hoping to create. His followers back home were probably laughing at him rather than admiring his bold confrontation with British authority. He needed to regain control of the situation quickly, or risk becoming an international laughingstock in his desperation. Marcus made a decision that would prove to be his biggest mistake yet. If his dog wouldn't intimidate the guard, then he would have to take matters into his own hands. He began to climb over the rope barrier, determined to confront the soldier face to face. "If you won't respond to a polite American tourist," Marcus declared as he stepped into the restricted area, "then maybe you'll respond to a direct challenge." The moment Marcus's expensive sneaker touched the ground on the wrong side of the barrier, everything changed. Guard Mitchell's training kicked into high gear, and what had been an annoying tourist situation suddenly became a potential security breach. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, Guard Mitchell was a motionless figure in an ornate uniform. The next, he was a highly trained soldier responding to a potential security threat at one of the most important buildings. In the United Kingdom, halt. The guard's voice boomed across the courtyard with such authority that several tourists jumped backward in alarm. His rifle moved with practiced precision as he took a step forward, his entire demeanor shifting from ceremonial to combat-ready. "Do not move another step." Marcus froze mid-stride, his confident swagger evaporating instantly. The voice that had just commanded him to stop contained a level of authority and controlled aggression that he had never encountered before. This wasn't the bored security guard he had expected to intimidate. This was a soldier. "Step back behind the barrier." "Immediately," Guard Mitchell commanded, his training taking complete control of the situation. Years of military discipline and countless hours of preparation for exactly this type of incident had transformed him into an imposing figure of absolute authority. The crowd fell completely silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something far more serious than tourist misbehavior. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people began backing away from the confrontation zone. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, all his carefully practiced intimidation techniques, his business world confidence, his American bravado, none of it meant anything when faced with genuine military authority. His hands began to shake as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his ego-driven fog. I was just ... Marcus stammered. But Guard Mitchell wasn't interested in explanations. "Move back now." The guard's voice cut through Marcus's weak protests like a blade. "You have breached a security perimeter. Comply immediately, or face arrest." Marcus scrambled backward so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet. His designer sneakers slipped on the cobblestones as he practically threw himself back over the rope barrier, landing in an undignified heap on the tourist. Sighted the divide, but Guard Mitchell wasn't finished. Having identified Marcus as a security risk, he followed protocol by alerting his colleagues. With sharp, precise movements, he activated his radio and began speaking in military codes that made Marcus's blood run cold. To control this as post. 7. I have a code yellow situation. American male tourist, approximately 45 years old, attempted to breach perimeter security. Individual is now compliant, but requires escort removal from the area. Marcus heard the words escort removal and felt his stomach drop to his knees. This was supposed to be a fun tourist video, not a genuine security incident. He looked around, desperately for support from the crowd, but found only disapproving faces and people actively filming his humiliation. Within minutes, additional security personnel began arriving from multiple directions. These weren't ceremonial guards in fancy uniforms. They were modern security officers with serious expressions and professional equipment. Marcus realized with growing horror that he had triggered a legitimate security response at one of the most protected locations in London. Meanwhile, Duchess had finished cleaning the ice cream from the cobblestones and was now sitting peacefully near a group of children who were petting her and commenting on her cute jacket. The little dog was completely oblivious to the chaos her owner had created, perfectly content with the attention she was receiving from her new friends. "Sir," one of the security officers said as he approached Marcus with calm but unmistakable authority, "I'm going to need you to come with us for a brief discussion about appropriate tourist behavior and security protocols." Marcus looked back at Guard Mitchell, hoping to see some sign of sympathy or understanding, but the soldier had already returned to his original position. He stood at perfect attention, rifle at the precise angle, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the confrontation was Marcus's continued presence in the crowd of tourists, who were now filming everything with their phones. The businessman who had flown to London expecting to be treated like royalty was about to learn. What happened when tourists threatened the actual royalty's security? This once-in-a-lifetime European adventure was about to take a turn that he would never forget. Oh no. For the reasons he had originally hoped. 3 hours later, Marcus sat in a sterile room at a London police station. His designer clothes wrinkled and his confidence completely shattered. The interview had been thorough, professional, and deeply embarrassing. British authorities had taken his passport information, contacted the American embassy, and made it very clear that his behavior had crossed several serious lines. "Mr. Thompson," the investigating officer said as he reviewed the incident report, "attempting to breach security at a royal residence is considered a serious offense under the Protection of Royalty Act. However, given that this appears to be a case of extreme ignorance rather than malicious intent, we're prepared to release you with a formal warning and a temporary restriction from all royal properties. During your remaining time in the UK," Marcus nodded frantically, grateful that he wasn't being charged with a crime. The officer's use of the word ignorance stung, but he was in no position to argue. The past few hours had been the most humbling experience of his adult life. "Furthermore," the officer continued, "your behavior was recorded by multiple tourists and has already begun circulating on social media. I strongly suggest you consider this a learning experience about respecting local customs and security protocols." As if on cue, Marcus's phone began buzzing with notifications. His own live stream had captured every moment of his humiliation. From his failed attempt to intimidate the guard to his panic scramble back over the barrier, the video was already spreading across platforms with hashtags like #TouristFail and #RoyalGuardWins. The comments were brutal. His business associates back in Chicago were asking if he had lost his mind. His social media followers were sharing the video with their own commentary about ugly American tourists. Worst of all, several news outlets had picked up the story, describing him as the American businessman who thought he could bribe and intimidate a Queen's Guard. When Marcus was finally released, he found Duchess waiting for him in the station's reception area. The little French bulldog had been cared for by a kind police constable who had given her water and a few treats. Unlike her owner, Duchess seemed completely unaffected by the day's events, greeting Marcus with her usual enthusiasm. The walk back to his hotel was a nightmare of recognition and whispered comments. Several tourists pointed at him and pulled out their phones, clearly recognizing him from the viral video. Marcus kept his head down and walked as quickly as possible, desperate to escape the public attention he had originally craved. Back at his five-star hotel, Marcus collapsed into an expensive chair and began to process what had really happened. His attempt to create viral content had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of being seen as a confident American taking charge, he was now internationally known as an entitled tourist who had been put in his place by British military discipline. The hotel concierge, who had been extremely attentive when Marcus first arrived, now treated him with cool professionalism. Word of his incident had apparently spread throughout London's tourism industry with remarkable speed. Marcus realized that his reputation had preceded him, not in a good way. Over the next few days, Marcus learned several painful lessons about the difference between respect and fear, between confidence and arrogance, and between being important and simply being loud. His remaining time in London was spent quietly visiting museums and avoiding any situation that might attract additional attention. Guard James Mitchell, meanwhile, had returned to his normal duties without giving the incident another thought. In his 3 years of service, he had dealt with dozens of similar situations. Entitled tourists who believed their money or nationality exempted them from local laws and customs were unfortunately common. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of encounter, and he had handled it with the professionalism expected of the Queen's Guard. When Marcus finally boarded his flight back to Chicago, he was a changed man. Duchess slept peacefully in her carrier, still wearing her expensive jacket, blissfully unaware that she had become famous as the French bulldog who refused to attack a royal guard. Marcus, however, spent the entire 8-hour flight thinking about respect, humility, and the importance of understanding that the world didn't revolve around his wallet and his wishes. The viral video would follow him for months, serving as a permanent reminder that some institutions and traditions command respect, not through fear or money, but through centuries of earned dignity and unwavering professionalism. It was a lesson that Marcus Thompson would never forget, and one that would fundamentally change how he approached every interaction for the rest of his life.